He was sitting at a table that cost more than his rent, wearing a jacket someone else had chosen for him, and the woman who had put him there had just told her entire family that he was not her boyfriend. She had said something else, something careful and clinical, a reclassification delivered in the same tone you might use to correct an item on a menu. She said he was her emotional support human. She said it calmly, between the appetizers and the main course, in a room full of people who had been watching him since the moment he walked through the door, and not one person at that table looked surprised. Mason did not move. He set down his fork, very slowly, and looked at her. She did not look back. And the thought he had, sitting there in her family's dining room, was not about the money. It was not even about the humiliation, though that was real, and present, and shaping itself into something it would take him several days to fully name. The thought he had was simpler. He thought, she planned this, and she did not tell him. He had no idea yet how much of the weekend had already been decided without him. Rewind to 6 hours earlier. Mason's flatmate Ben had been eating cereal from a mixing bowl when the call came in. He did it every Thursday, something about the volume-to-effort ratio, which he had once explained at length in a way that Mason had stopped following after the first sentence. Ben had the television on, and was watching something with subtitles he was not reading, and Mason was standing at the counter eating toast, because the toaster had burned one side and he was too tired to make more. His phone rang, unknown number. He almost let it go. The woman on the other end spoke before he could finish saying hello. She said her name was Evelyn Hartwell. She said she needed a date for a family dinner that evening. She said she had found his number through a mutual contact he could not immediately place, that he came with a recommendation for being discreet and not easily rattled, and that she was willing to pay $300 for 3 hours of his time. Mason looked at the burned side of his toast. $300 was more than he made in 2 shifts. He asked what the dinner was for. She told him her family had been pressing her about a potential engagement, an arrangement that had been in the process of being formalized, which had now become complicated, and that arriving alone would invite questions she did not want to field. She needed someone capable of holding a conversation and not flinching at wealth. She said she was not asking him to perform. She said she was asking him to sit there and be a person. He said yes. He asked if there was a dress code. She said she would send a jacket. The jacket arrived by courier 40 minutes later. It was charcoal gray. It fit him exactly right, which meant she had made a reasonably precise guess about his size, which he chose not to think about. Ben watched him button it up from the couch. He said it looked expensive. Mason said it probably was. Ben asked if this was one of those situations that seemed fine now but would be strange to explain later. Mason said he hoped not. Ben went back to the cereal. The Hartwell estate was 40 minutes outside the city center. The car she had sent waited at the curb and said nothing for the entire drive, which Mason appreciated. He used the time to establish a few basic facts about himself that he would need to keep consistent. He and Evelyn had met at a gallery opening 3 months ago. They had been spending time together since. Nothing too specific, nothing that required dates or details. Vague but warm. The kind of story that satisfies a curious relative without providing enough for a follow-up question. He had done this once before, at a different family dinner for a different reason, and the lesson from that experience was that no one really wants to investigate a love story once it feels real enough. People want to see 2 people who seem comfortable together. That was all. The estate itself was what you expected from people who sent jackets by courier. Stone front, old trees, a drive long enough to give the house time to register before you arrived. A woman opened the door before the car stopped. Older, composed, dressed in something dark and formal, with the particular stillness of a person accustomed to rooms going quiet when she entered. She looked at Mason the way you might look at a document you had requested and were now evaluating for accuracy. He introduced himself. She said she was Eleanor Hartwell and that she was pleased to meet him. He did not think she was. Evelyn appeared at the top of a short flight of stairs. She was exactly what her voice on the phone had suggested, precise and contained, in a way that made you aware of every small movement she made. She was wearing something the color of late winter sky. Her hair was up. She came down the stairs and stopped 2 feet away from him and said it was good of him to come. He said, of course. They had rehearsed nothing, and so there was nothing to rehearse. He followed her through a wide hallway past what appeared to be an original painting he did not know well enough to name. There were 4 other people at the table when they arrived. Eleanor at the head. To her left, a woman in her early 30s with a notepad beside her plate, which Mason noted and filed. Across from her, a younger woman with very bright eyes and a phone she put away just slowly enough for him to notice she had been about to use it. Next to her, a woman who looked up when Mason entered the room, looked at him steadily for exactly as long as it took to say hello, and then looked back at her water glass. Evelyn introduced them. The woman with the notepad was Vanessa, the eldest sister. The bright-eyed woman was Poppy, the youngest. The quiet one was Clara. He sat down. He ordered water. He made conversation about the house, about the drive, about a painting in the hallway that turned out to be a family acquisition from a trip 3 decades ago. All of it easy, all of it fine. He felt comfortable. He thought this was going well. Then the appetizers arrived, and Evelyn demoted him. She did it mid-sentence, somewhere between the discussion of a recent trip Vanessa had taken and a question Eleanor had been building toward for several minutes. She did not lead up to it. She said, very clearly and without any particular emphasis, that Mason was not her boyfriend in the conventional sense. She said he was something closer to emotional support. She said he was there because she found his presence stabilizing, in the same way other people found stability in rituals or objects, and that while she valued him, and she did say this, she said she valued him, she did not wish anyone to read more into it than was there. The table was quiet for a moment. Mason picked up his fork. He set it back down. He looked at Evelyn. She was looking at her plate with the careful composure of someone who had decided not to look up until a particular moment had passed. Her jaw was slightly tight. The vein at her temple was not visible, which meant she was controlling it. He thought, she planned this. He thought she did this publicly, to a room full of people who would now take it as given, so that no one could ask him to be anything more than whatever she had just named him. He thought, this is a management strategy. And then he thought, with what he would later recognize as his first real mistake of the weekend, he thought this might be the strangest $300 he had ever earned, and left it there. He turned to Eleanor, who was watching him with the quiet attention of someone very curious about what he would do next. He said the estate reminded him of somewhere he couldn't quite place. He asked if the east wing had been built in the same period as the rest of the house. Eleanor blinked. Then, with what might have been approval, she answered. The dinner continued. He was careful for the rest of the meal. He was pleasant and present and warm enough to seem real without being anything Evelyn had not described. He paid attention to the sisters. Vanessa asked him 3 direct questions about his background and wrote nothing down, which told him she was memorizing the answers. Poppy said very little, but watched him with the focused energy of a person trying to solve something. Clara asked him once whether he wanted more water, and when he said yes, she filled his glass from the pitcher closest to her without asking someone else to do it. A small thing, he noticed it. After the main course, while the family moved to a different room for dessert and conversation, Mason found Evelyn near the window alone. He said her name. She turned. He said, "That was not what I agreed to." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said that the situation had required an adjustment. She said she hoped he understood. He said, "I understand what happened. I am asking whether you plan to explain it." She said the family had been pushing toward something formal between herself and the arrangement her mother had facilitated. She said arriving with someone she described as a boyfriend would have created expectations she did not intend to fulfill. She said calling him what she had called him was the most honest option available. He said, "You could have told me that before I got in the car." She said she had not known he would respond well to honesty in advance. He looked at her for a full 3 seconds. She did not look away. He said, "You owe me an explanation, and you owe me it before anyone else in this house asks me to be something else." She said, "Fair enough." She did not offer one immediately, but she said it, and he believed she meant it, and that was enough to get him through dessert. He had been planning to take the car home at 9. He had been planning to cash the check, forget the jacket, and file this under experiences that were good for the money even if they were strange. What he had not planned for was Poppy. She found him in the hallway near his coat, 10 minutes before 9, and she said, "Oh, are you leaving?" He said yes. She looked genuinely disappointed. Not performed, actually disappointed. She said she had been hoping they could talk. She said she had questions. She said she had been trying to figure out all night what he saw in Evelyn, because Evelyn was her sister, and she loved her, but she was also genuinely difficult, and she did not meet a lot of people who seemed unbothered by that. He said he had agreed to 3 hours. She said he had spent 20 minutes of those hours driving here, and 20 minutes eating soup, and the really interesting part of the evening had not started yet. He almost left. He had his coat in his hand. Then Clara walked through the hallway on the way to somewhere else, and she slowed when she saw him, and she said, "Are you going?" He said yes. She said, "That seems right." He paused. He said, "Does it?" She said, "You came for what you said you came for. You were polite. If you want to leave, you should." There was something in that, the absence of any pull. She had given him the easy exit without attaching anything to it. He noticed that too. He was still noticing it when Evelyn appeared at the far end of the hallway and said, "Eleanor would like a word." Eleanor's word took place in the sitting room, with all 4 of her children present, and Mason standing near the door in a charcoal jacket that fit him exactly. Eleanor was seated. She had the posture of someone who sat because she chose to, not because she was tired. She looked at him without warmth and without hostility, with something more neutral and more difficult, which was genuine attention. She said she was going to be direct with him. She said she respected what she had seen at the dinner table, the way he had absorbed what Evelyn had done without collapsing, and pushed back on it without making a scene. She said she was curious about him. She said she had a proposal. He said, "I am listening." She said there was a guest room. She said the weekend was long and the house was large, and she thought it might be interesting, for all of them, if he stayed until Sunday. She said each of her daughters could have a small amount of time with him. She said she wanted to see who he was when he was not being performed at. He said, "And what does Evelyn think of this?" Evelyn, from across the room, said nothing. Eleanor said, "Evelyn thinks it is efficient." He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the fireplace. He said, "I have 3 conditions." He said them without preamble, in order. No touching without permission, no filming or tracking his location. And if he said he was leaving, no one was to negotiate. He said he would give them until Sunday. He said after Sunday, whatever this was, it was over. Eleanor said, "Agreed." He looked at Clara. She was looking at her hands. She was the only one in the room not watching him. He said, "I will stay." Clara offered him the guest room personally. A small thing, but she had been the one to ask rather than simply telling him where it was. She walked him to the door, showed him the window that stuck, pointed out the extra blanket in the chest at the foot of the bed, and said good night in a tone that expected nothing from him. 10 minutes later there was a knock. He opened it. Evelyn. She was standing in the hallway with a glass of water he had not asked for, which she held out to him as though it were something that needed transferring. He took it. He said, "Come in or don't, but don't stand in the doorway." She came in. She stood near the window. She said, "You handled yourself well tonight." He said, "You demoted me in front of your family." She said she was aware of that. He said, "I want to know why." She said, "I told you. Expectations." He said, "That is what you told the room. I am asking what you would tell me, if the room were not there." A pause. She looked at the window. She said, "I did not know how to introduce you as something real, because you are not real, and calling you real would have obligated me to things I could not guarantee." He said, "I know I am not your boyfriend. You know I know that. You could have said I was a friend." She said, "Friends do not wear jackets I selected." He looked at her. She was still looking at the window. He said, "Intent is what you wanted to happen. Respect is what you bothered to notice." She was quiet. He said, "I know the difference. Make sure you do." She left. He stood there for a moment with the glass of water. He thought about the $300. He thought about Ben eating cereal from a mixing bowl while the television ran. He thought about Clara saying, "That seems right." And the thing about it, the thing he could not immediately explain, was that she had meant it. She had not said it to be kind. She had not said it to be strategic. She had given him a clean exit because she genuinely believed he was entitled to one. And in a house full of people who believed very different things about what he was entitled to, that was something he found himself thinking about as he fell asleep. Friday started early. Vanessa knocked at 8, which was earlier than he would have chosen, and stood in the hallway in something that managed to be both formal and practical, with a light jacket and a folded list he could see the edge of. She said, "I have you until noon." She said, "I thought we would walk the grounds first." He said, "You brought a list." She said, "I always bring a list." They walked. The estate in the morning was different from the estate at dinner, quieter, colder, with dew on the grass and long shadows from the trees on the east side of the property. Vanessa walked with the pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going and was not interested in being distracted. She asked him questions. She did not write anything down. The questions were good, not intrusive, but precise. She asked what he found difficult about the dinner. She asked what he understood about Evelyn that most people got wrong. She asked whether he trusted easily. He answered all of them. He was honest because the questions were honest, and because dishonesty in that context would have felt like an insult. She took him to a community kitchen in the town 15 minutes from the estate. She had been volunteering there on Fridays for 4 years. She did not explain why. She simply walked in, put on an apron, and got to work, and he got to work beside her, and for 2 hours they said very little and did useful things. Near the end of the shift, she was slicing bread, and she wanted to show him something about the angle of the cut. She reached toward his wrist to adjust his position, then stopped. She said, "May I?" He said, "Yes." She corrected his grip. She said, "Better." She went back to her own station. He stood there for a moment with the knife in his hand at the new angle, thinking about the fact that a Hartwell, in this house, in this family, in the middle of a morning she had planned around him, had asked, had not assumed, had stopped and asked. On the walk back to the car, she said, "I want to tell you something about my sister." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "Evelyn confuses caring with control. She always has. It is not cruelty, it is fear. When she is afraid of losing something, she learns everything about it and manages it until the fear stops. The problem is that the thing stops breathing." He said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because you seem like someone who breathes." She checked something off her list. She did not explain what it was. At 11:45, Evelyn appeared. She was in the car park of the community kitchen, leaning against a black car she had not driven here this morning. She said she had been passing by. Vanessa looked at her. Vanessa said, "You have been passing by for 15 minutes. I watched you park." Evelyn said, "It was the most efficient route." Vanessa said, "That was jealousy, Evelyn." Evelyn said nothing. Mason got in Vanessa's car and said goodbye to Evelyn through the window. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she looked away. He thought about what Vanessa had said. He thought about what it meant to be someone's fear response wearing a human face, and whether you were obligated to be kind to it. That afternoon, the world outside the estate found out about the dinner. Someone at the table, he did not know who, and he did not ask, had filmed the moment Evelyn demoted him. Or not the moment exactly, but the aftermath. His face, very still, and Evelyn saying the words, and the particular quality of the silence that followed. It was 22 seconds long. By the time Poppy's yellow convertible pulled up to the front of the house at 1 o'clock, it had been viewed 40,000 times, and someone had added a cartoon collar to his image in the still frame. Poppy showed him. She was delighted. He was not. She drove badly but confidently, with the radio loud, and she took him to parts of the city he had not been to in years. A rooftop cafe that required knowing someone who knew someone. A street where someone was selling prints of old maps. A bridge with a view of the river that she said she always meant to photograph and never did. She had a camera around her neck the whole time but rarely raised it. When she did, she asked. On the rooftop, while they were drinking something cold, she said, "I am going to tell you something." She said, "I know why Evelyn did what she did at dinner." He said, "Tell me." She said, "She was scared." Evelyn gets scared like other people get cold, silently, and then all at once. She had told herself this was a transaction. She brought you in as a transaction, and then you showed up and you were a person, and she didn't know what to do with that, so she made you smaller on paper so she could still feel like she was in charge. He said, "That sounds like a diagnosis." She said, "I have been watching her do it for 26 years. He said, "What does she do when the thing she made smaller gets bigger than she expected?" Poppy looked at him over her glass. She said, "Usually she reorganizes." He thought about that. On the street near the maps, he felt his phone buzz. Location request, Evelyn. He turned off location sharing entirely. Not angry, simply done. He had given his 3 conditions at the outset. Tracking was on the list. On the walk back to the car, Poppy stopped in front of a second-hand shop and looked at something in the window. An old electric fan, the kind with a domed cage, worth nothing to anyone who hadn't once owned one. She said her grandmother had had one exactly like it. She said she had given it away after she died, and she had thought for years afterward that she should have kept it. She said this with no performance, in a matter-of-fact way, and then she walked on, and he walked with her, and neither of them said anything else for most of the drive back. He had liked Poppy in a way that felt uncomplicated. She was chaos, but honest chaos. She did not have a plan. She had a camera and a car and a small grief she carried neatly inside the brightness, and she had given him an afternoon with no agenda, just the city and the company of someone who was not trying to determine his value or absorb him into something larger. He was sorry, a little, when she pulled into the estate and Evelyn was standing at the top of the steps. Clara came for him at 9 on Saturday morning with coffee, not from the estate kitchen, from outside, which meant she had left the property to get it, which meant she had made a decision about it rather than letting the house handle the detail. She handed him the cup through the guest room doorway before she said good morning. He took a sip. It was exactly right. He said, "You know how I take it." She said, "You got it wrong at the machine last night. I watched you fix it twice." He had not thought anyone was watching. He looked at her. She was holding her own cup with both hands the way people do when the morning is still cold, and she was not looking at him with anything that needed a response. He said, "Where are we going?" She said, "There is a bookstore I like, if that is all right." He said it was. The bookstore was not the kind that gets featured in photographs. No ladder on a rail, no cats on the windowsill. It was narrow and a little overstocked, with shelves that went slightly off-level near the back and a wooden floor that registered every step. Clara moved through it the way she moved through most spaces, without announcing herself, stopping when she found something, moving on when she didn't. She did not talk much, and when she did, it was about the books rather than about him. He picked up something near the back, a novel he had heard of but never read, with a cracked spine that meant someone else had read it hard. He turned it over. He put it back. He moved on. She found him 10 minutes later holding a different one, something he did not expect to be in a place like this. She said, "Is it good?" He said, "I don't know. I've been trying to decide whether the ending ruins the rest of it." She said, "What kind of ending?" He said, "The kind where everything resolves, everyone where they're supposed to be, all the threads pulled in." She said, "You don't like that." He said, "I think it depends on whether it's earned or just arranged." She said, "I like when it ends before the characters figure out it's over. Not sad, just honest. Real things don't announce themselves." He looked at her. She had gone back to a shelf and was examining something he couldn't see from where he stood. He said, "That's a sad preference." She said, "I think it's an accurate one." They stayed another 20 minutes. He bought the cracked spine novel. She bought 2 paperbacks, both of them worn, and she paid with cash from a coat pocket without looking at the amount. On the street outside, someone recognized her. He noticed because it changed her. Not dramatically, just a small compression, like a door closing somewhere internal. The person was pleasant and meant no harm and stayed only a moment. But after they left, Clara looked at the street around them and said, "I know somewhere smaller." The somewhere smaller was half a mile away, a shop the size of a large closet, with a handwritten sign in the window and books arranged in a system that was either deeply intuitive or entirely random. The man at the desk was old enough not to care about being recognized. He nodded at Clara as though she were someone who came regularly, which she apparently did. They stood in the fiction section, which was one shelf, and argued. Not badly, not unkindly. Clara said she thought characters who survived their stories were almost always less interesting by the end. That the cost of being changed was that you lost the version of yourself that made you compelling to follow. He said that was a way of saying you preferred people who didn't learn anything. She said that was not what she had said. He said it was the logical conclusion. She said logic and truth were not the same thing. He said that was a dodge. She said it was a position. They went back and forth for a while. She was not competitive about it. She did not need to win. She simply held her ground with the quiet confidence of someone who had thought about this before and would continue thinking about it after. He liked that. He liked arguments that didn't require anyone to surrender. When they left the small shop, she said, "I want to cook something." She said, "Is your apartment nearby?" He said, "You want to cook at my apartment?" She said, "My kitchen at the estate is staffed on Saturdays. I would be directed." He thought about Ben. Ben would be either home or not home, and either way was probably fine. He said yes. Ben was home. He was eating cereal from the mixing bowl, again, and he looked up when Mason came through the door with a woman he hadn't seen before and showed no surprise whatsoever, which was one of his better qualities. He said hello. Clara said hello. Ben picked up his bowl and his book and relocated to his room with the ease of someone who had decided the room was his destination all along. Clara found the kitchen. She looked at what was in it with the careful attention of someone solving a small problem. She said, "Do you have mushrooms?" He said he thought so. He went to check. She came to check at the same time, and they were both reaching into the same low cabinet, and their fingers landed on the same bag of dried mushrooms at exactly the same moment. He felt the contact. She did not move her hand away immediately. Then she did, and she said, "You take them," and he handed her the bag. She cooked. He helped where she told him to and stayed out of the way where she didn't. She burned the garlic once. A small cloud of smoke and a very quick expression of frustration before she scraped the pan clean and started again. He did not say anything. She said, "I burned the garlic." He said, "I know." She said, "I was distracted." He said, "It happens." She looked at him briefly. Then she went back to the pan. They ate at his small table with the window open. Outside, someone was arguing with someone on the floor below about a package. Clara ate without commenting on the argument, or the table, or the apartment, which he appreciated. He had had people over before who performed being comfortable in a way that was the opposite of comfort. She simply ate. He said after a while, "Why did you come back inside the night I was leaving?" She said, "I didn't. I was walking to the kitchen." He said, "You slowed down when you saw me with my coat." She said, "I noticed you." "That is not the same as coming back," he said. "What's the difference?" She said, "I gave you the exit. I was not going to take it away from you, because I wanted you to stay." He looked at her. She was eating. She had said it the way she said most things, without building it up, without watching for his reaction. He thought about the dried mushrooms and the earlier question about endings, and he thought about the fact that she had driven herself here instead of sending a car, had bought her own coffee from outside, had not once in 2 days behaved as though he belonged to anything other than himself. He said, "Do you always leave before you're disappointed?" A pause. She looked at her plate. Then she said, "Yes. I got very good at recognizing the moment just before, and I started leaving then. It got to be a habit." He said, "That's also a sad preference." She said, "I know." They sat with that for a moment. The person downstairs had stopped arguing. The window let in a smell of someone else cooking, something with onions, far away. He asked, "Did you want to stay at the apartment?" She looked up. He said, "I have a second chair and the novel I bought. You don't have to go back yet." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Evelyn comes at 4. He said, "It is 12:30. She said, "All right." They stayed. He read the crack-spine novel for an hour, while she finished one of her paperbacks. She put her feet up on the edge of his chair without asking. Not presumptuously, just comfortably, as though the space had been large enough for her all along. He let it be. He was 3 chapters in when he noticed she had stopped reading and was looking out the window at the same thing he couldn't identify earlier, and he thought, "She is doing what she said she does. She is checking for the moment just before." He said her name. She looked at him. He said, "You don't have to leave early." She said, "I know." She went back to her book. He went back to his. When 3:30 came, she marked her page carefully, folded down the corner of something he hadn't seen her mark, collected her coat, and said she had enjoyed it. He said, "I know you did." She stopped at the door. Not dramatically, just for a second, the way you stop when you've been given something true and want to carry it correctly. Then she left. Evelyn arrived at 3:32, not 4. He watched her come up the building steps from the window, and he felt a thing he did not immediately name. Not quite irritation, not quite recognition, something somewhere between the two. He opened the door before she knocked. She said, "I finished earlier than expected." He said, "Clara's turn goes until 4. She said, "She's not here." He said, "I know, I am." She stood in the hallway. She said the most efficient option would be for him to return with her now, since the time would otherwise be spent waiting in his apartment for a turn that had already concluded. She said it pleasantly, with the composure of someone presenting a practical arrangement. He said, "Then no." She looked at him. He said, "I said if I told you I was leaving, no one negotiates." The same applies to the other direction. Clara's time is until 4. It doesn't become your time because she left early. She said, that seems unnecessary. He said, you agreed to my conditions before I came. A silence. Not hostile, just the pause of a person recalibrating. He watched her face do something it rarely did, which was show him something unmanaged. For a second, standing in his hallway with her coat on and her composure around her like armor that had suddenly become one size too small, she looked like someone who had been told no and had not known she was still capable of feeling it. He said, I will see you at 4. He closed the door. He stood in his kitchen for a moment. He thought about Vanessa saying, she confuses caring with control. He thought about Poppy saying, usually she reorganizes. He thought about the way Evelyn had looked, not angry, which he would have known how to manage, but something quieter and harder. Something that looked, if he was being precise about it, like hurt. At 4, he went back to the estate. He had been there long enough by that point to know the shape of the house, which doors were typically open, which rooms were preferred in the evening, where Eleanor liked to position herself in a room, and where Evelyn preferred. He had begun to feel, without quite meaning to, like someone who knew the geography of a place, which was not the same as belonging to it, but was adjacent in uncomfortable ways. He was walking toward the sitting room when he heard them. He stopped because Clara was already stopped, 3 feet ahead of him, in the hallway that bent just before the door. She had her hand lightly on the wall, not hiding, just still. Her expression was careful. Eleanor's voice, then Evelyn's. He heard Eleanor say, it was done before the weekend. The family had already closed the process. He heard Evelyn say nothing for a moment. He heard Eleanor say, you know that, you knew it when you called him. And then, very quietly, Evelyn said, I thought he might come if I gave him a problem to solve. I didn't know if he would come if I asked without a reason. Clara turned slowly and looked at him. He looked back at her. He had been hired for a problem that had not existed. The engagement, the urgency, the reason he had put on the charcoal jacket and gotten in the car and agreed to $300 for 3 hours, none of it had been necessary. It had been architecture. Evelyn had built a room for him to stand in, with a reason large enough that refusing it would have felt rude, because she had not known how to build a door and knock on it and ask. He walked back down the hallway. He kept his steps quiet, not angry. He did not have the energy for anger yet. Something more fundamental than anger. The thing you feel when you discover that a choice you thought you made was never quite yours. Clara walked with him. She did not try to touch him, or to explain, or to fill the silence with anything. She simply walked at the same pace, which was fast, and matched him without comment. In the front room, he stopped at the side table where he had set a few things on his first night. He picked up the key to the guest room. He walked to the sitting room door and opened it without knocking. Evelyn looked up. Eleanor did not move. He set the key on the table between them. He looked at Evelyn. He said, I know what the job was not for. I know what the weekend was. I know you had reasons for it, and I am not asking you to explain them right now, because I am not going to be able to listen to an explanation tonight in a way that does justice to it. He said, don't turn this into another explanation. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair where he had left it 2 days ago. He walked to the door. Clara was standing in the hall. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, I'm going. She said, I know. He said, will you come? A pause, short. Then she said yes, and got her coat from the hook by the door, and they left. The rain started before they reached the petrol station at the edge of the estate's road. Not heavy, the patient, steady kind that commits without apologizing. Clara had left her car just outside the gates, and they stood near it while he unlocked it, and she stood with one hand in her coat pocket and the other at her side, and neither of them were talking. He leaned against the car. He said, ask me something. She said, not tonight. He said, Clara. She looked at him. He said, there is something you want to ask. I can see you not asking it. She was quiet for a moment. Rain on the roof of the car beside them. A lorry going past on the road beyond the hedge. She said, I want to ask whether any of this, the 3 days, the time, whether it was, for you, something. Not for her, not for the arrangement, just whether something happened for you. He looked at her. He said, ask me again when it's over. She looked back at him. Then she reached across and put her hand over his, where it rested on the car door. She did not say anything. She held it there, in the rain, with no urgency and no speech and nothing she was asking him to confirm. Just contact. They stayed that way for a while, long enough for the rain to get into his collar a little, which he noticed and didn't mind. Then she got in the car, and he walked around to the passenger side, and they drove back to the city with the radio very low and the wipers going steadily, and he thought about the question she had asked, and the answer he hadn't given yet, and felt, somewhere underneath the complicated thing he was still processing about the weekend, a different kind of feeling, quieter and more certain, the way something you've been hearing for days becomes clear when someone finally turns down the noise. Julian Vale called on Sunday morning. Mason was at his kitchen table with the novel he had bought at the bookstore, which he had not managed to finish the night before because he had read the same page 4 times and accepted that his mind was elsewhere. Ben had made toast and left it on the counter without comment, which was his way of acknowledging that something had happened without requiring a briefing on it. The soup had come at midnight, a bowl, left outside his door, still warm. He had eaten it standing in the hallway. The name on the phone was one he didn't recognize. He answered anyway. Julian Vale introduced himself in the way people do when they know the name will land a certain way and are choosing to let it land gently. He said he was a mutual acquaintance of Evelyn's. He said he understood this was an unusual call. He said he had information Mason might find useful, and he was asking whether Mason wanted it, because he was not in the business of inserting himself where he wasn't wanted. Mason said, "Tell me." Julian said he had been Evelyn's intended. He said the arrangement had been his family's and the Hartwells, organized and then disassembled over a period of months. He said the disassembly was mutual and, on his end, a relief. He said he was calling because he had heard, through the family, that Mason had been brought in after the arrangement concluded, and because he thought someone ought to say plainly what that meant. He said, the engagement process was closed before she hired you. Not by a few days, by long enough that there was no emergency to solve. Whatever she told you about needing someone there, the need was not the one she described. Mason said, I know. I heard it last night. Julian said, good. Then I'm confirming it, not delivering it. A pause on the line. Julian said, she is not easy to know. I suspect you have gathered that. I suspect you are also in the middle of deciding what to do with it, Mason said. I am, Julian said. Then I want to say one thing, and you can discard it if it doesn't apply, he said. Do not confuse being the first thing she wanted with being obligated to become what she gets. Those are separate questions. She chose you, with some architecture around the choosing, but the choosing was real. What you do with that is yours, not hers, not her family's, yours. Mason said nothing for a moment. Then he said, were you unhappy with her? Julian said, I was not unhappy with her. We were wrong for each other in the way that two correct things can be wrong for each other when they are placed in the same room. She needed someone who would stay interested in the negotiation. I needed someone who had already given up on it. He said, I think you might be the former. I am not telling you what to do with that information, Mason said. Why are you telling me any of this? Julian said. Because no one told me when I was in a similar position, and I think that was unkind of everyone involved. He hung up. Mason sat with the phone face down on the table for a long moment. The toast Ben had left was cold. He ate it anyway, standing at the counter, looking at nothing in particular. Ben came out of his room at some point, not intruding, just present, refilling the kettle. He said, you look like someone who already knows what he's going to do. Mason said, do I? Ben said, you've had that face since last night. The one where you're not confused, you're just annoyed that you're not confused. Mason looked at him. Ben shrugged and took his tea back to his room. He sat down. He picked up his phone and sent Evelyn a message. He said, if you want to have a conversation, it happens in front of Clara, not separately, not at the estate where your family can arrange the furniture around it, somewhere neutral, today. Her reply came in under 2 minutes. She said, I know a cafe on Brendan Street, 3 o'clock. He said, Clara comes. A longer pause this time, then, yes. He called Clara. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting for a call without asking for one. He explained. She said, are you sure you want me there? He said, yes. She said, all right, I'll meet you at 2:45. He spent the morning doing ordinary things with the deliberate focus of someone who knows the afternoon will be the opposite of ordinary. He did the dishes. He changed the bedding. He read 40 pages of the novel and finally finished the chapter that had defeated him the night before. It was good. The ending was earned, not arranged. He thought Clara would disagree. At 2:45, Clara was outside the cafe with 2 coffees, one of which she handed him without ceremony. He took it. They stood on the pavement for a moment. She said, "How are you?" He said, "I don't know yet." She said, "That's honest." He said, "Julian called this morning." She said, "I know. Vanessa told me. She said he'd been thinking about calling for 2 days." He said, "Did you know about the engagement? Before this weekend?" She said, "I knew it was finished. I didn't know Evelyn had used it as the reason to bring you in." "Not until the hallway," he said. "And after the hallway?" She said, "I was angry on your behalf. And then I thought about why she did it, and I was something else on her behalf. Something smaller, sadder." He said, "Not excusing her." She said, "No, just understanding her. Those are different things." He looked at her. She was holding her coffee with both hands again, the way she always did in the morning, even though it was mid-afternoon and the day was not cold. He said, "Let's go in." Evelyn was already there. She was at a table near the window, not the center of the room, not a visible power position, which he registered as a choice. She was wearing something dark and unremarkable. Her hands were around a cup she had not touched. She looked, when they walked in, like someone who had spent 2 days preparing for something and had now arrived at the moment and found that preparation was a different thing from readiness. She looked at Clara. Clara looked at her. Something passed between them that was not hostility and was not warmth. Something more fundamental. The look of 2 people who love the same family and know what the other has paid for it. Evelyn said, "Thank you for coming." Mason sat down. He did not start with preamble. He said, "I want you to say it. Not the version you explained to your mother, or the version that makes it make sense. The actual reason." Evelyn looked at her cup. She said, "I knew the process was closed. I knew before I called you." He said, "And?" She said, "And I wanted you there. Not to solve anything. Not because it was efficient. I wanted you in that room, and I didn't know if you would come for that reason, because that reason is not a transaction, and I don't know how to offer things that aren't transactions." He said, "So you built one." She said, "Yes." He said, "And the whole weekend? Your mother? The arrangement? The turns?" She said, "The weekend was my mother's idea. I didn't design it, but I also didn't stop it." He said, "Why not?" A long pause. She said, "Because it kept you there. Each day kept you there. And I was aware of how that sounded even while I was letting it happen, and I let it happen anyway." He said, "I need you to understand something." He said it without heat, because he had burned through the heat the night before, standing in a hallway with a guest key in his hand. He said, "I came for 3 hours. Everything after that was mine to give or not give. You can't bank it or manage it or keep it, because it was not yours to begin with." She said, "I know." He said, "I don't think you did. At the time." She said, "No. At the time I thought—" She stopped. She said, "I think I believed that if I could just get you into the right configuration, the outcome would be what I wanted. And I knew that was wrong even while I was doing it. That is not an excuse. That is just what happened." Clara had not said anything. She was not performing silence. She was simply allowing the room to be what it needed to be, and he was aware of her doing it, and he was grateful in a way he couldn't have named precisely. Evelyn said, "I am sorry. For the way I hired you, and for what I called you at the dinner table, and for the tracking, and for arriving early to Clara's time." She said each item as its own sentence, not rushing through the list, meaning each one. He looked at her. She was looking at him with the steadiness of someone who had decided not to look away from the answer, whatever it was. He said, "I hear that." He said, "I need some time before I can tell you what I do with it." He said, "But I heard it." She nodded. She reached for her cup and took a sip of whatever had gone cold in it, and her hands were steady, and he respected her for that. He said, "I am going now, and I think this conversation needs to finish somewhere else," she said, before he stood. The video. "The dinner clip. I can have it removed from every platform before tomorrow morning. I don't know whether the university has seen it or whether it will become a problem for you, but I want you to know that I can remove it immediately, and that I will, regardless of what happens here." He looked at her. He said, "Ask me when it becomes a problem, not before." She said, "All right." He and Clara left. On the pavement outside, she said nothing for a moment, and neither did he. They walked to the end of the block before he said, "Thank you for being there." She said, "You didn't need me there." He said, "No, but I wanted you." She looked at him sideways. He looked straight ahead. They walked another block before she said, "Ben told me you already know what you're going to do." He said, "Ben talks too much." She said, "He also makes excellent soup." He said, "He does." They parted at the corner. He watched her go for a moment, the particular way she walked, not hurried, not performing ease, just moving through the world at her own pace with her coat around her and her books under her arm. And he thought, yes. He thought, I have known for longer than I've admitted. He went home. He read the rest of the novel. He slept. Monday morning, Vanessa and Poppy arrived at his building at 9. Not Evelyn. He noted this. The family had sent the ones most likely to be heard without resistance. Vanessa was in the black coat. Poppy had brought pastries in a paper bag, which she offered him with the energy of someone who knew the pastries were not actually the point, but believed strongly in covering all bases. He said, "You're not here to convince me." Vanessa said, "No, we're here because Eleanor asked us to escort you, if you were willing. She said the house is yours to walk into or not. She said she wanted you to know the offer stood." He looked at the pastries. He took one. He said, "Give me 10 minutes." He changed his jacket. Not the charcoal one, which he hadn't worn since Friday, because Evelyn had chosen it, and he had needed to establish the boundary of that, and then reconsidered it somewhere around 8 that morning. Not because it was hers, because it was, by now, simply his, worn in and known, and deciding to avoid it would have been its own kind of ownership. He put it on. He went downstairs. Poppy said, "Nice jacket." He said, "I know." The estate looked different a fourth time. Smaller, somehow. Not diminished, just known. He had learned its proportions. The long drive, the stone front, the east side trees he had walked past with Vanessa in the morning dew. He had been here long enough to stop being impressed by it. Eleanor met them in the hallway. She looked at him with the same attention as she had the first night, but the quality of it had shifted. Less evaluation, more something he might have called acknowledgement. She said, "Come in." The sitting room had been cleared of arrangement. That was the word he found for it. Walking in. Arrangement. Whatever configuration the family had positioned themselves in for each evening of the weekend, the careful seating, the framedness of it, was gone. The room was just a room. Some chairs, a fire, the regular evidence of a family that lived in a house rather than performed it. Evelyn was not there yet. Eleanor sat. He sat across from her. Vanessa stood near the window. Poppy sat cross-legged on the floor without comment, which was the most natural thing anyone in this family had done in 4 days. Eleanor said, "I want to say something before my daughter comes in." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "I used you." She said it plainly, without softening the edges. She said the weekend had been designed, in part, as a lesson for Evelyn, a way to show her, through demonstrated evidence rather than lecture, the difference between managing someone and caring for them. She said she had thought his patience was the right material for that lesson. She said she had underestimated what it cost him to provide it. She said, "That was unfair, and I'm sorry for it." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I appreciate that." He said, "I'm not going to tell you it was fine, because it wasn't, and you'd know I was lying." She said, "I would." He said, "But I also don't think you're a cruel person. I think you made a decision about someone's life without asking him, and you dressed it up as an opportunity. I think you know that now," she said. "I do," he said. "Then we're done with it." She nodded. Poppy, from the floor, was very carefully not looking at either of them with her full face, which meant she was paying complete attention. The fire had been going long enough to have settled into a steady burn. He could hear the paper when Evelyn walked in. A small sound, her coat moving, the particular slight on hardwood of her step he had catalogued without meaning to, the way you register sounds in a house you've occupied long enough to know. She came in and stood near the fireplace. She was holding papers, several sheets, the edges not quite aligned, held in both hands with a grip that was not casual. He recognized the type, something prepared, something worked on. She said, "I wrote this 11 times. She said it to the room, not to any one person. Then she looked down at the first page and then, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has thought about this particular gesture for longer than it seemed, she crossed to the fireplace and fed the pages into it. Not all at once. Sheet by sheet, the paper caught quickly. She let each one go and reached for the next, and her hands were steady right up until the last one, and then, very slightly, they weren't. She turned away from the fire. She said, "I have been thinking about what to say since Saturday night. I wrote versions that explained myself, and versions that apologized, and versions that tried to make it logical, and they were all accurate in parts, and none of them were the thing." She said, "The thing is that I hired you because I wanted you there, and I was afraid to say so." She said, "I demoted you at that table because you were more than I planned for, and I needed to reduce the size of it." She said, "I appeared at Vanessa's time and Poppy's time and Clara's time because I could not stop thinking about you in conversation with someone else, and that was not a calculation. It was the most genuinely embarrassing evidence I have ever produced of my own feelings, and Vanessa was correct to name it." She said, "I think about you when you are not there." She said, "I have been thinking about you for longer than this weekend." She said, "I do not know what to do with that in a way that does not turn into management, and I am aware that managing it has cost you something, and I am sorry." She said, "I love you." She said it as its own sentence, not attached to a condition. She said, "And you are allowed to say no." The room was very quiet. The fire behind her had reduced the 11 versions of this speech to a small, bright column of ash. Clara, who had come in at some point, he had heard her, but not turned, was standing near the doorway. Poppy had a hand over her mouth. Vanessa was looking at the window. He sat forward. He reached into the inner pocket of the charcoal jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. He had had it since Thursday. The original agreement, 1 page, standard terms. The kind of document that meant something only because of what came after it. He set it on the table between them. He tapped it once with 2 fingers. He said, "That was the agreement. 1 dinner, 3 hours." He said, "Everything after that was mine." He looked at Evelyn. She was watching him with the stillness of someone who has burned all their prepared materials and is now standing in the result. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it not as a wound, but as the most honest thing I can offer you." He said, "What you gave me this weekend, the attention, the management, the care that got expressed sideways, I felt it. I am not going to pretend I didn't. That shoulder settle on the first night, the umbrella, the jacket, I knew what they were, even when you were calling them something else." He said, "But here is the difference," he said. "You learned everything about me and used it to keep me inside a situation you controlled. And Clara learned one thing about me, how I take my coffee, because she watched me get it wrong, and she didn't use it to arrange anything. She used it to hand me a cup in a doorway." He said, "You used knowledge to keep the world predictable. She used it to make room for me inside it." He said, "Those are not the same kind of attention, and I know which one I want to live inside." He said, "I'm choosing Clara." Evelyn's face did something then. Not the composure dropping. The composure was intact. She held it intact deliberately, and with effort he could see and respected. But underneath the composure, something left. The room behind the eyes that had been running calculations all weekend went very quiet. Not cold, emptied. The way a room looks after everyone has left and the lights are still on. She said, after a moment. "All right," he said. "That's not the end of knowing each other," he said. "I don't know what it is." "But it's not nothing," she said. "I know," he said, "the video." I said, "Ask me when it becomes a problem." "It hasn't yet," she said. "It will be gone by tonight." He said, "Then thank you." He stood. Clara came forward. Not to him, not yet, but she moved into the room properly, not standing at the edge of it. Evelyn looked at her. Clara looked back. Evelyn said, "Don't apologize." Clara said, "I wasn't going to." Evelyn said, "Good." A beat. Poppy lowered her camera. She had raised it at some point during the confession, almost without meaning to, a lifetime's instinct, and Vanessa reached over without looking and put 2 fingers on the lens. Poppy lowered it. Vanessa took the custody schedule from her coat pocket. She looked at it once. Then she folded it in half and dropped it onto the table beside the original agreement, and neither of them said anything about it. Eleanor said, from across the room, in a tone that was very close to ordinary, "Would anyone like tea?" Poppy said, "Yes." The room breathed. Tuesday arrived the way good things often do, without announcement, without the weight of everything that had preceded it. Mason woke early. not because anything required it. He lay in bed for a moment looking at the ceiling, aware of the particular quality of a morning that belongs only to itself, not to any arrangement or negotiation or room full of people watching to see what he would do. He got up. He made coffee correctly, from memory, without needing to fix it twice. Ben was already in the kitchen. He was eating toast, actual toast, from the toaster, which meant he had made a deliberate effort, and reading something on his phone with the relaxed posture of a person for whom Monday had already answered all the outstanding questions. He looked up when Mason came in. He said, "Tuesday." Mason said, "Tuesday." Ben said, "Good." That was the whole conversation. Mason poured his coffee and drank half of it at the counter and felt, for the first time since Thursday, that he was simply standing in his own kitchen without any additional meaning attached to it. He dressed without deliberating over the jacket. He put on the charcoal one without ceremony, the way you put on something that has been yours long enough to stop announcing itself. Clara had suggested Breakfast, a place near the river she had mentioned once, briefly, in the bookstore, as the kind of cafe that did not require you to know someone to get a table. He had remembered it because she had said it without expectation, a piece of information offered rather than deployed. He arrived 3 minutes early, and she was already there, at a table near the window, with her coat on the back of her chair and her hands around a coffee she had ordered while she waited. She looked up when he came in. She said, "You're almost on time." He said, "I was exactly on time." She said, 3 minutes early is a different kind of late." He sat down. He ordered eggs and toast and more coffee, and she had already eaten something small before he arrived, which he discovered when the server took her empty plate, and she said she had been hungry earlier and had not wanted to wait, and he said that was entirely reasonable. She said, "I thought you might think I was being rude." He said, "Eating when you're hungry is not rude." She said, "My mother disagrees." He said, "I'll note that for future reference." She smiled, not broadly, just the edge of it, the corner, the expression that stayed mostly internal and only let a small amount through. He had been cataloging her expressions over 4 days without meaning to, and this one was the one he liked best, the one that meant she was genuinely amused rather than performing it. They ate without urgency. Outside, the river was visible between two buildings, the gray-green of it in the morning, the light on it doing something uncomplicated and fine. People passed on the pavement with coffee and dogs and the specific absorbed walk of a city morning. He watched them. She watched them. Neither of them felt the need to comment. He said, "At some point between the eggs and the second coffee, Ben said I already knew what I was going to do." She said, "Ben said the same thing to me." He said, "She said she was going to say something, and then she said the whole thing in one sentence, the way people do when they've been rehearsing it for 2 days. She repeated it back to him fairly accurately. He said, "When did he call you?" She said, "Sunday night, while you were reading." He said, "He didn't tell me that." She said, "He said you'd be annoyed." He said, "I'm not annoyed." She said, "I know." He looked at her. She was looking at her coffee. There was something in the way she held the cup, both hands, always both hands, even when the coffee was no longer warm enough to need it, that he had decided was the most characteristic thing about her. Not her quietness or her precision or the way she gave clean exits, the cup in both hands, a small extra weight of presence, like she was making sure she was really there. He said, "You asked me something on Saturday night, at the petrol station." She said, "I know what I asked." He said, "I told you to ask again when it was over." She looked up. He said, "It's over." A pause. Rain had come through on Sunday and cleaned the glass, and now the light through the window was clear and without complication. The river between the buildings was doing its uncomplicated thing. Someone outside was arguing with their dog about the direction they were walking and losing. She said, "Is there something that happened for you? During the weekend, the 3 days, the time with me. Was it something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes what?" He said, "Yes, it was something. It has been something since the bookstore, or possibly since the mushrooms in the cabinet, or possibly since you told me that you leave early before you're disappointed, and I thought that was the saddest and most honest thing anyone had said to me in a long time." He said, "Yes, it was something." She was quiet. Not the silence of someone gathering themselves, the silence of someone who has been carrying a particular weight and has just set it down, and is noticing what that feels like. He said, I know the timing is strange. He said, I know the weekend was a lot. She said, the timing is strange. The weekend was a lot. He said, and? She said, and I would like to keep having Tuesdays with you, if that answers the question. He said, it does. They left the cafe sometime after 10 and walked along the river, which was the plan she had mentioned without insisting on. The path was uneven in places, old stone, the kind that has settled into itself over time, and stopped apologizing for the gaps. She walked on his left. She had her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes on the water, and she said things occasionally, about a boat she liked the look of, about a building on the far bank that she had always thought was the wrong color for its context, about the dog from outside the cafe which had apparently won the argument about direction and was now very far ahead of its owner on the path. He listened. He said things back. It was the easiest conversation he had had since Thursday, which was not a high bar given what Thursday through Sunday had contained, but which still felt true and worth noting. At a point where the path widened and the river bent, and there was a low wall to lean on if you wanted, she stopped. She turned to face him with the directness she reserved for things she had decided to do rather than things she was considering. She said, I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it clearly. He said, go ahead. She said, I want to know if you would like to have dinner with me. Not with a family. Not at an estate. Just the two of us, somewhere I choose, because I want to take you somewhere, and not because anything needs to be arranged around it. He said, yes. She said, yes? He said, yes, Clara. She was looking at him with an expression that had let more through than usual, more of the interior, more of whatever lived behind the quiet and the careful pacing and the early departure habit. And he thought, this is what she looks like when she's decided not to leave before she's disappointed. This is what she looks like when she stays. He kissed her, not dramatically, just forward, deliberate, the way you do something you have been thinking about for long enough that the thought and the action feel continuous. She kissed him back with the same quality, present and unhurried, one hand coming out of her coat pocket and finding his arm, and the river did its uncomplicated thing beside them, and the dog somewhere behind them barked at something irrelevant, and the morning went on around them the way mornings do, indifferent and luminous. When they separated, she said, very quietly, you got there. He said, eventually. She said, it was the right pace. He thought, yes, it was. They walked back along the river. The city was loud by the time they reached the end of the path and turned back toward the streets. Delivery bikes and a market opening up and someone setting chairs outside a bar that would not open for hours yet. Optimistic. He walked beside her with no particular destination beyond the end of the morning, which felt, after the weekend that had preceded it, like an extraordinary luxury. He thought about the weekend. He thought about Thursday and the charcoal jacket arriving by courier, and the dinner table and the look on Evelyn's face in the hallway after he had told her he would see her at 4. He thought about the community kitchen and the bread cut at the right angle and Vanessa asking, may I? He thought about Poppy and the old electric fan in the shop window and the grief she carried neatly inside the brightness. He thought about the mushrooms and the burned garlic and the argument about endings and Clara's feet on the edge of his chair. He thought about the hallway, the guest key, the rain. He thought it cost something. The weekend cost something real. He had walked into a situation under a premise that wasn't true, had been scheduled and filmed and tracked and arranged and publicly reduced, had been the material of a lesson he hadn't agreed to teach. That was not nothing. That was a real cost. He also thought, and yet the bread cut at the right angle, and yet Poppy's fan and her quiet grief, and yet Ben leaving soup outside the door, and yet Clara, hands around a cup in a Tuesday morning cafe, saying she would like to keep having Tuesdays. He thought, the best relationships do not have owners. They just have people who keep choosing to stay. He looked at her. She was watching the market stall being set up. Someone was arranging flowers with a focus that suggested they cared very much about the arrangement, and she had the expression she wore when she was interested in something and not performing the interest. He said, what are you thinking about? She said, that those flowers are going to fall if they keep stacking them that way. He said, should we warn them? She said, they seem confident. They watched. The top flower did not fall. She said, I was wrong. He said, you were right about the risk. Just wrong about the outcome, she said. That's a kind way to put it, he said. I thought so. They walked on. 1 week later he drove back to the estate, not because anyone had asked. He had received no message, no invitation with architecture built around it. He had decided on a Thursday morning that he wanted to have dinner with the family, and he had called Vanessa, who had answered with the particular tone of someone who was pleased and was choosing not to perform the pleasure, and said, 7 o'clock, and we will tell no one you're coming so that no one can prepare. He arrived at 7. Poppy opened the door, and her expression was the wide-open version she reserved for things that delighted her, and she recovered it in about 2 seconds, which he respected. She said, "You came." He said, "I said I might." She said, "You said ask me then," which is not quite the same thing. He said, "Close enough." The dinner was different. The furniture was in its usual positions. No arrangement, no staging. Eleanor asked him about his week with the attention of someone who actually wanted to know. Vanessa told a story about a misprocured order at the community kitchen that was funnier than it had any right to be. Poppy argued with Vanessa about whether a photograph needed to be technically correct to be emotionally true, and the argument was loud and involved historical examples he mostly didn't know and was interesting anyway. Clara sat next to him. She said very little, but she laughed at the photograph argument in the real way, the one that surprised her, and when the bread came, she broke off a piece and handed it to him without asking, because she had noticed, during dinner at his apartment, that he always took from the end of the loaf rather than the middle. He noticed her noticing. Livelyn was at the table. She sat across from him and to the left, which was not the closest seat and not the furthest, and she participated in the dinner in the way that someone participates when they have made a deliberate decision about what role they are occupying. She asked him, once, whether the university had said anything about the video. He said, "They mentioned it." She said, "Do you need anything done?" He said, "Not yet." She said, "Ask me then." And she said it without any of the architecture that had surrounded the same phrasing all weekend, just plainly, an offer with a door in it, rather than a room already built around him. He said, "I will." She passed the salt to Poppy. She ate her dinner. She was present in the way of someone learning a different mode of presence. Not performing it yet, but doing the real work of locating it. He thought about what Vanessa had said. She confuses caring with control. He thought, she is trying to unconfuse them. He thought, that is not a small thing. After dinner, when the table had been mostly cleared and Poppy had put music on that no one had agreed to, and everyone had accepted, Evelyn came to stand near the doorway where he was talking to Eleanor about something architectural. She waited for a pause. She said, "I had a thought about the housing issue you mentioned." He looked at her. She said, "I know someone at the university accommodation office who owes me a favor." She said, "If you want me to make a call, I will." She said, "If you don't, I won't mention it again." He said, "Let me think about it." She said, "All right." She went back to the table. She put a strawberry from her own bowl onto Poppy's plate when Poppy wasn't looking, the small private gesture of a person redistributing something without requiring acknowledgement for it. He watched and looked away and thought, she is finding another way to do it. Small and unannounced, outside the architecture. She is learning. He drove home. Clara had left before him. She had an early morning and had said goodnight with the ease of someone who did not feel the need to match her departure to his. He had said, Tuesday. She had said, Tuesday. That was enough. 1 month later, Mason and Clara were in a bookstore cafe that was neither the large one nor the small one. A third one, which Clara had found because she found bookstores the way other people found their keys, by knowing roughly where they ought to be, and walking toward them with confidence. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The cafe was not full. Someone nearby was working on a laptop with the focused energy of a person meeting a deadline and failing. Clara was reading something she had picked up from the shelves 20 minutes ago that she had not bought yet, which was her usual method. She read enough to know if she wanted to finish it, and then she bought it, and she had said once that she could not understand buying a book you hadn't already started. He was eating crackers from a small packet she had produced from her coat pocket, without announcing them. He had not known they were there. He had discovered them when she put them on the table and said, "You hadn't eaten since morning." He had said, "You noticed that." She had said, "I was nearby." He thought, yes, she was nearby. That was its own kind of attention, not managing the distance, not engineering the proximity, just present, in the way a person is present when they are paying the kind of attention that doesn't announce itself. The video was gone. Evelyn had removed it as promised, and the few places it had surfaced elsewhere had followed. The comment about the cartoon collar was still somewhere, probably, but it had no original to point to, and was becoming the kind of thing that would fade before anyone needed to decide what to do about it. The family had its own rhythms now, rhythms he was adjacent to rather than inside, which was the right proportion. The Thursday dinners, when he went, were the same as the second one had been. Loud, occasional, the family as it actually was rather than arranged for evaluation. He went when he wanted to. He said no when he didn't. Evelyn accepted both with the same equanimity, which he did not take for granted because he knew what it cost her. She had called him once, mid-month, about the housing issue. She had made the call and reported the outcome, and said, "It should be resolved before next term." He had said, "Thank you." She had said, "Ask me if anything else comes up." He had said, "I will." She had hung up without prolonging it, and he had sat with the phone for a moment and thought, "She is learning." Slowly and with visible effort, and probably at some internal cost he could not fully see, but she was learning. He thought about the weekend. He thought about it the way you think about something that has become part of the terrain. Not obsessively, not constantly, but when something reminded him of it, like the bread angle or a yellow car or a ceiling fan. He thought, it was strange. He thought, it was real. He thought, the cost of it was real, and the things that came from it were also real, and both of those things could be true without one canceling out the other. Clara turned a page. She had the expression of someone who had decided to buy the book. He could tell from the way she was holding it, more carefully now, as though it had become something she didn't want to damage. He said, "Good?" She said, "Yes. The ending is going to ruin it, though." He said, "You don't know that yet." She said, "I can feel it coming." He said, "You always leave before you're disappointed." She looked up at him. She said, "I am not leaving. I said the ending was going to ruin it. I am still reading it." He said, "So you're staying to be disappointed?" She said, "I'm staying to find out if I was right." He took another cracker. She went back to the book. Outside the cafe window, the street was doing its ordinary afternoon things. A bus, a child pulling against a hand, a man with too many bags redistributing them on a bench. Nothing remarkable, nothing requiring arrangement. He thought about the first night, the car pulling up the long drive, the stone front, the woman in the doorway who had looked at him like a document, the dining table and the 22 seconds of silence and the guest key. He thought about all the versions of himself he had been in that house. The hired date, the emotional support human, the man who laid down 3 conditions and meant them all, the man who walked out with a guest key and walked back in of his own choosing. He thought, you cannot be owned. You can only be chosen, and the choosing has to go both ways, and it has to keep going. Not as a transaction, not as an arrangement, not because someone built a room for you and made it comfortable enough that leaving felt difficult. It has to keep going because you look at the person across from you and you think, yes. Because she has crackers in her coat pocket from knowing you hadn't eaten. Because she argues about endings and stays to find out if she's right. Because she holds her coffee cup in both hands even when it's cold, making sure she's really there. He thought, the best relationships do not have owners. They just have people who keep choosing to stay. Clara put a cracker in her mouth without looking up from the page. She said, around it, stop thinking so loudly. He said, I'm not saying anything. She said, no, but you have the face. He said, what face? She said, the one where you've worked something out and you're deciding whether to say it. He looked at her. She was reading, still, apparently committed to finding out whether the ending ruined it after all, with her coffee going cold in both hands and the book held carefully and a cracker packet she had been carrying in her pocket all day on the off chance that he had forgotten to eat. He said, I worked something out. She turned a page. She said, I know. He said, I'm not going to say it. She said, I know that too. He ate another cracker. She kept reading. Outside, the man with the bags had sorted himself out and moved on. The bus had gone. The street was just the street again, ordinary and clear and going about its business without requiring anything from either of them. He thought, yes, this. He thought, ordinary Tuesdays. He thought, her, here, and the crackers, and the argument about endings, and the way she stays to find out if she's right. He thought, this is what choosing looks like when no one is watching. This is what it feels like when it's yours.